In this lesson, we're going to consider the integrity of the New Testament. That is, that what you're reading in your New Testament is just what was written originally by the inspired men. Now, that's a legitimate area of inquiry inasmuch as it's been centuries since Matthew and Mark and Luke and John and Peter and Paul and James and Jude wrote the New Testament documents. And people have a very legitimate question, needs to be answered. Is it possible that there have been corruptions that found their way into the text of Scripture? Is it possible that the copyists, after all, the Bible's been copied and recopied and yet recopied again? Is it possible that a copyist's error could have gotten into the text? Or maybe some theology that was personal to the copyist could have found its way into the text? The answer is yes. That there have been errors of transmission made by copyists, and uninspired statements have even found their way into the text of Scripture. Now, this is dealt with by the science of textual criticism. These men, scholars, detect the error and then seek to restore the original text. Now, what we're going to do in this lesson is to compare the manuscript value of the New Testament documents with the manuscript value of some of the classics from history. And then we'll be able to see what F.F. Bruce meant when he stated that the evidence for the New Testament is ever so much greater than the evidence for the classical histories. Now, when we say manuscripts, we talk about manuscript value. When we speak of the manuscripts, we're not speaking of the originals. None have survived, either of the New Testament or of the classics. We don't have Matthew's original document. We don't have Mark's or Luke's or John's. They're gone. They're lost to us. We don't have that copy called the signatures. That is, the epistles that were written by the apostles and then signed with their name at the end of it. They're lost. They're gone. And perhaps that's best, because knowing the propensity of man to venerate ancient documents, especially if they were attached to men like the apostles, they could become objects of worship. Idol worship could take place. Somebody else could even attach certain kinds of power to them that they have no business attaching to it. But when we speak of the manuscripts, we are certainly not speaking of the originals, nor are we speaking of translations. That is, we're not talking about taking the copies that we have and translating them from the original Koine Greek in which they were written to English or to German or Malayalam or Hindu or some other language. When we speak of the manuscripts, we're talking about copies. We're talking about the copies that are image reproductions. Ideally, not simply word for word, but letter for letter. Now, what we want to do in this particular lesson is to make that manuscript attestation comparison. We want to compare the New Testament manuscript copies with the manuscript copies of the classical histories. And you want to see the chart that from the middle of the chart, which will stand for the first century, from these lines on the left where these original documents were penned, and then the lines carry us to the end, which marks the time of the best copies in our possession. Now let's look first of all at the manuscript copies of the classical histories. First, we want to notice Caesar's Gallic Wars. Now, Caesar was more than a warrior. He was also a man of letters. And he wrote what's called Caesar's Gallic Wars, and he wrote this between about 58 to 50 B.C. Now, we don't have the original. It's gone. It's lost. But we do have a copy. Now, we have about 9 or 10 good manuscripts, and the best one that's of any use to us is coming from about the middle of the 9th century. Now then, from the original writing lost to us to the best copy in our possession, we have about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 900-year gap between the original that Caesar wrote and the copy in our possession. Now let's notice the Roman history of Livy. Livy wrote from about 59 BC to 17 AD, and of the 142 original books, only 35 survive, and in only 20 manuscript copies. Now, the best copy in our possession comes from about the middle of the 4th century. So if he wrote it somewhere around the middle of the 1st century BC, and the best copy in our possession is about 350 AD, then we have about 400-year gap between Livy's original documents and the best copy in our possession. Now let's look at two more of these. We've already seen Tacitus is rated as the most outstanding of ancient Roman historians. Now he gave us 30 books. He gave us some 16 books of annals and some 14 books of his histories. Now he wrote around 100 to 115. And out of the 30 books that he wrote, less than half survive. Only 14 and a half books have come down to us in our century, and only from 2 manuscripts. One manuscript of the histories reaches down to about the 9th century. Now there's a gap of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 centuries. And then we have from the Annals, which he wrote about the same time, and the best copy in our hand goes out here to the 11th century, a gap of some 900 years to 1,000 years. 2 manuscript copies is all we have. And yet, classical historians will not listen to an argument, says Bruce, that any one of these could be challenged because the gap is so far from the original writing to the best manuscript copy in our possession. Now let's go into deep antiquity. Let's look here at the writings of Thucydides and Herodotus. First of all, Thucydides wrote somewhere about the middle of the 4th century BC. And the best manuscript copy in our possession is way over here in the 9th century of our own era. Well, that's a gap of about 1,300 years. And the same thing is true of Herodotus. Just about the same documentation. We've got 8 manuscript copies of Thucydides. We have about 8 manuscript copies of Herodotus. And the best ones that are of any value to us, we're told, come from about the 9th century of the Christian era. 1,300-year gap that separates the original writings that are lost to us from the very best copies that let us know that he did the writing. Now, I want you to see what Bruce says about that. Bruce makes the observation that the evidence for our New Testament writings is ever so much greater than the evidence for many writings of classical authors, the authenticity of which no one dreams of questioning. That's what I think we need to emphasize here, that even though the manuscripts that the originals were written so long ago and are so far separated from the manuscripts in our possession, that as far as classical historians are concerned, those manuscript copies authenticate what we have, that they are an authentic representation of what was originally written by these historians. Now, as far as the historian is concerned, the same standards that apply to the classics have to be applied to the New Testament equally. And of course, that's right. Now then, let me read to you just a couple of statements from Bruce in regard to this same thing. In regard to Herodotus and Thucydides, he makes this observation. The history of Thucydides, about 460 to 400, is known to us from 8 manuscript copies, the earliest belonging to about 900, and a few papyrus scraps belonging to about the beginning of the Christian era. The same is true of the history of Herodotus. Yet, no classical scholar would listen to an argument that the authenticity of Herodotus or Thucydides is in doubt, because the earliest manuscript of their works, which are of any use to us, are over 1,300 years later than the originals. Classical historians are absolutely persuaded that the few manuscript copies in their hands, separated by centuries from the originals, are nevertheless an authentic representation of what was originally written by those men. Now, if that same kind of an attestation can be made for the New Testament, if the New Testament, if you apply to the New Testament these same criteria, and it passes, then to be fair, we're going to have to insist that the New Testament documents, that is, the New Testament manuscript copies, will be authentically representative of what was originally written by the apostles. Suppose, then, that I were to tell you that we have in our possession 50 manuscript copies of the Greek New Testament. Now, the New Testament was originally written in Koine Greek. And then it's copied and it's copied and it's copied. Suppose we had 50 copies. Suppose we had some of those 50 copies were a total reproduction from Matthew to the book of Revelation, all of the books of the New Testament. Suppose I said that we had some of those copies were just fragmentary. Some of those were in part, but we had 50 manuscript copies. And suppose that from the time that the New Testament was completed, which has to be at the end of the first century, prior to that, yes, but at least beginning from the first century when they were completed, to the best manuscript copy in our hand. Suppose that out of those 50 copies, the best manuscript copy did not go beyond the 9th century, and suppose one or two of them came back here to the year 350. Well, we would not only be doing at least as well as the Roman history of Livy, we would be not only doing as well as Tacitus, far better than Herodotus and Thucydides. We would have to say that there is a superior manuscript attestation for the New Testament copies than there is for the classics. Well, what if I told you we had 100 copies of the Greek New Testament? Suppose I told you we had 1,000 copies of the Greek New Testament, in whole or part. F.F. Bruce tells us that we have some 5,000 copies of the Greek New Testament in whole or part. How are we doing by the numbers? Very well. Now, out of those some 5,000 copies of the Greek New Testament, we have 5 very ancient copies that are in excellent shape, and they go very far back in time, being very close to the time of the original production. Before we begin to look at those, I want to look at this word codex. We look at the Sinaiticus Codex, or we look at the Codex Alexandrinus. What's a codex? Well, you know, originally there were scrolls, long pieces of paper, and on the end of the paper was attached sticks, and they would roll these up, and then they would read them this way, and they would turn them. You see? Later on, they found out that if they cut these into leaves of equal size and sewed them together, you'd come up with what we call a book. They called it a codex, a codex. And so we have 5 ancient books, ancient codices. Remember now, these are copies, image reproductions, as it were. And we find that the first of these is called the Codex Sinaiticus. Now, it's so called because Tischendorf, the great Roman scholar, the great German scholar, in about the middle of the 19th century, was in the Sinaitic Desert, there at St. Catherine's Monastery, where he discovered the Sinaiticus Codex. And later on, it was bought by the British Museum and is there now under vacuum and glass. The Sinaiticus has the entire Bible, all of the New Testament, as well as many other books. Now, the Sinaiticus was copied about 350 A.D. That would be removed from the completion of the New Testament by only 2.5 centuries. Only 2.5 centuries separate the original writings of the apostles from the copy that is made, that's come down to us in the form of the Codex Sinaiticus. Now there's another codex that rivals the Sinaiticus for antiquity and for reliability, authenticity, and this is the Codex Vaticanus. You can hear it. The Vatican, it was discovered in the Vatican. And it has the same attestation. It was written, it was copied about the year 350. Then there's the Codex Alexandrinus. You can hear it. Alexandria, Egypt. And it was copied about the middle of the 5th century BC, giving only 350 years. 350 years from the time that the New Testament shut down until that copy was made. Then we have two more copies. We have the Ephraimaic, and that was written, copied sometime in the 5th century, about 350, maybe 400 years from the original to the copy. And then we have the Bezae. And the Bezae is presently in the library at Cambridge. And it was written somewhere about the 5th century. Perhaps there's a 400-year gap that separates the copy in our possession from the original that was written by the apostles. Now, these five are, for the most part, they contain the entire New Testament. Now, the Ephraimaic Codex there does not have 2 Thessalonians or 2 John, but the rest of the New Testament can be located. Now, how are we doing in relation to the numbers of copies in our possession? Well, there have 8 copies for Thucydides and 8 manuscript copies for Herodotus and some 20 manuscript copies for the Roman history of Livy and so forth. But we have 5,000 copies of the Greek New Testament. 5 of these go back even to 250 years from the original, 350, maybe 400 years at the outside. Now, as far as the historian is concerned, when you apply the criteria to the classics, then you must apply the same criteria to the New Testament. Now, you can see that the gaps from the original to our copies is far less of a gap than anything we have in these classical histories we've noted. And in addition to these 5 ancient copies that have the entire New Testament, we have 4,995 more. Now, how are we doing in relation to the manuscript value of the New Testament as compared to the manuscript value of the classical histories? It is a superior attestation. You can see that it is. Now, that's not the statement of a biased Christian. It's the statement from the facts. And they're available to you just as well as they are to me. Frederick Kenyon was formerly the curator of the British Museum. This man could speak about manuscripts with the authority that no one else seems to have been able to approach. Be that as it may, Bruce makes this observation from Frederick Kenyon. He says, "We may quote the verdict of the late Sir Frederick Kenyon, a scholar whose authority to make pronouncements on ancient manuscripts was second to none. The interval, then," he quotes Kenyon as saying, "between the dates of the original composition and the earliest extant evidence becomes so small as in fact to be negligible. And the last foundation for any doubt that the Scriptures have come down to us substantially as they were written has now been removed. Both the authenticity and the general integrity of the books of the New Testament may be regarded as finally established." That shows you that the New Testament value of the manuscripts, the copies in our possession, is exceedingly better than what we have from the classical histories. So, from the vantage point of the historian, if the criteria applied to one has to be equally applied to the other, then if we accept the manuscript copies of the classics that are in our possession as authentic representations of what was originally written, we're going to have to accept that the manuscript copies from which we get our New Testaments today and make our translations is just as good, we've seen, It's far, far better. Now, let me just give one illustration of some of the other manuscript copies that we have in our hands. There is in our possession a group of books that were found, New Testament fragments of the New Testament books. And it's put into a kind of volume called the Chester Beatty Biblical Papyri. Now there are some 11 portions of the books of the New Testament, not whole books, pieces, fragments of the New Testament in all of these 11 books. But these fragments of the copies of the New Testament were written even earlier than the Codex Sinaiticus, earlier than the Vaticanus, some 100 to 200 years earlier than our best codices in our possession. Now, 3 of these books in the Chester Beatty Biblical Collection has most of the New Testament books mentioned. One book has 4 Gospels and the book of Acts, and it was copied about the year 200 to 250. Well, that only leaves a gap of about 100 to 150 years. Then another of the books contains Paul's letter to the churches, plus the book of Hebrews, and that was copied about the 2nd century A.D., leaving a gap of only 100 years from the time that the New Testament apostles wrote the originals until these copies were made. And they're in our possession. And then we even have a fragment of a copy of the book of Revelation, which was copied about the year 250. Well, that would be a gap of about 150 years. Now, with all of the copies in our possession that have such an outstanding attestation, wouldn't you say that the New Testament that you're reading, which is translated from these copies, is not only at least as reliable as the copies that we have for Tacitus or Thucydides or Caesar's Gallic Wars, that it's just as good as those? You know now as well as I do that our New Testaments come from a manuscript attestation that is far superior to the classical histories. We can be grateful to God and His providence for having provided these copies for us. You can rest assured that what you're reading in your New Testament is a 99 and 44/100% authentic representation of what was originally penned.